Exposing Africa's part in the slave trade. It's so easy to say white man did it to us, but we share in the responsibility. These were the words of Benin's ambassador to the US, Cyril Ogwin, to an audience at Southern University, Louisiana in 2003. But Benin is not an outlier in the African world. Slave networks in this part of the world have existed for quite some time, and it still does. We often hear about the transatlantic slave trade, but it was really one link in a centuries-old chain. Slavery has been a part of human history for millennia. Its evidence can be found in the Egyptian wall paintings, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, the oldest code of law from the 18th century BCE, and even the Bible. Similarly, Korea and its preceding kingdoms had a long tradition of slavery as well. It's a difficult topic, but one that is only understood from one side of the curtain. So here's a sneak peek behind the curtain. Here's a look at Africa's role in the slave trade. Almost every major African empire in history kept slaves. Those great ancient Egyptians, they kept slaves, and the mighty powerhouse of Carthage, they traded slaves across their vast network. What about the empires of Mali and Aksum? Yes, to them too. What about the Arab Muslims? Well, the trans-Saharan slave trade yielded close to 10 million people from across Africa to be used as slaves in the Islamic world. The middleman does all the legwork. The idea that European nations and their American colonies were the only parties involved in the business of buying and selling people is absurd. And that brings us to the Africans, who, contrary to popular belief, were not passive victims or even helpless bystanders. They had a complete network of slave trade that the Europeans tapped into. When the Portuguese entered Africa in the 15th century, they overwhelmed some wayward tribes with their gunpowder and firearms, and this trend continued as other European nations made their way to the continent. However, it was relatively ineffective, as they were only able to pick on small groups in coastal areas. But to scour an entire continent to establish a supply would have required conquest, and that would have meant penetrating inland, and that would have required considerable resources. But there was an easier method. Just let the existing African slave traders do the legwork. Pay a little fee to the middleman, et voila, everything's hunky-dory. Not only did the status quo in these regions assist European slavery, but they also benefited from it. The textiles and cloth that Europeans brought to Africa were seen by the royalty as social symbols. In other words, it was the iPhone of the Middle Ages, or Gucci, or Ferrari, etc. You get the point. And they were happy to haul up slaves and sell them to foreigners. It was a win-win for them. As opposed to traveling to the Arab world to sell slaves, they just had to offload them to the colonialists at the shores. It was a much easier job than the one they had been doing for centuries. The long history of African slavery. Take the Ghana Empire, for example. That existed from the 4th century to the 13th century CE. In West Africa, it controlled key trade routes from northern Africa to the south. The empire's wealth was centered on the trade of gold, ivory, copper, and salt that they found in mines, but someone had to work day and night to extract those minerals, and that's where slave labor came in. Then they utilized their trans-Saharan trade connections to sell slaves as well. The slaves that were sold were mostly war captives from neighboring tribal groups who were too disjointed to mount a significant offense against the empire. Another source of slave supply was criminals, so the locals saw it less like treating people as subhumans and more as taking out the trash. Contrary to the latter transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery in those times was not purely racial, but it was institutions like this that the Europeans later exploited. After all, it was too much work for them to do everything, so they decided to outsource the capturing slaves part to the locals. To pursue slavery successfully, you need a highly organized group because somebody has to go out there, somebody has to locate the victims, somebody has to lead an army there, somebody has to capture them, transport them to the selling centers, all the time keeping an eye on them to make sure they don't revolt, and then sell them and move on, said the former mayor of Accra, the capital of Ghana, in an interview. The successors of the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, relied on similar routines. Slave labor was utilized in agriculture and mining, and just like in the previous case, the criminals, or social excess, as they would have thought about it, were put out to pasture. Cities like Timbuktu were important trade hubs, and slaves constantly shifted hands. But Mali didn't just export slaves, they imported them too. Two, especially female ones, for domestic help in aristocratic households, and Mali was not alone. For several centuries, African slave trade and slave labor were the norm, from Benin to the Songhai Empire to various city-states along the Swahili coast, and it had a social aspect to it as well. In most urban societies, the number of slaves someone owned was a telling indicator of their social status and wealth. The Colonizers March In. Fast forward to colonial times, and the Akan people in modern-day Nigeria were keeping 1/3 of their population as slaves. Under the umbrella of the Ashanti Empire, and outside it, they brought from and sold to the Europeans. The neighbors of the Ashanti Empire, the Kingdom of Dahomey, were probably the most notorious of the lot. Once they gained control of multiple slave ports with their large army and kept expanding their enterprise. They were basically the Romans of Africa, strong military structure and slaves for agriculture and domestic chores. They even had an all-female military unit, which the Europeans called the Dahomey Amazons. Now, at different points in history, slaves in some Roman cities may have comprised 1/3 of the urban population, but the Dahomey kingdom was a step ahead. By the 19th century, 2/3 of their population was enslaved. Like some other West African cultures, they also practiced slave sacrifice in moments of social significance. Slavery was such a big part of their life that when the Brits asked them to stop sacrificing slaves, and they signed a treaty to stop the slave trade altogether, they made an alliance with France. But the French were not too happy with the alliance after the collapse of the Dahomey society brought about by abolitionist policies. The French fought 2 wars to subdue their former allies, bringing an end to them by the late 19th century. It should be noted that the empire was not the only African society with such a stark emphasis on slavery. For instance, the spiritual aspects and religious connotations of owning slaves were not distinct to Dahomey. The neighboring Ovo Empire had similar rituals, including slave sacrifices. Another example from the same region is the Kingdom of Benin. Not modern-day Benin, the kingdom sold off so many slaves to the foreigners that they ran short on able-bodied men. Eventually, they had to abolish slavery for the sake of survival, but others were not too happy to comply. When the British rode after, it suddenly dawned on them that all men were created equal. The British wanted to go easy since stopping trading was easier than challenging the locals' way of life. Even after slave trading was abolished, rooting out domestic slavery would have broken social hierarchies, leading to civil strife. But it had to happen eventually. Wrestling with a complicated legacy. And this provided an excuse for the foreign powers to subdue the groups that were out of line. The French, especially, would colonize parts of Africa on this basis. By the time the transatlantic slave trade came to a close, around 20 million Africans had been sold off to the British, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Dutch. A significant portion of these would have to undertake a long journey to reach the Americas. A lot of ships were also lost to bad weather and accidents. When it was all said and done, the crimes of colonization were teamed up with the crimes of slavery. But that's simply false. colonization and slavery in Africa may have been equally detrimental, but were two fairly distinct phenomena. As the West reckons with the complicated legacy of slavery, it's about time that the African continent should recognize its part in it as well. We hope you liked this video, even if it was a little disturbing and controversial. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more. That's it for now. We hope to catch you in the next one.